Overthinking is often just a byproduct of a capable mind operating without boundaries. We have to recognize that the mind is a high-performance engine. It needs restraint.
Welcome to Resilient Inspirations. Around here, we believe every story carries a lesson, and every question opens a new door. Think of this as friends talking over coffee, exploring ideas together. So let's get started, and I'll pass the mic to the conversation.
Welcome to the debate. Today, our focus is on overthinking. It's a habit we all know, but it's often really misunderstood. The source material defines it pretty precisely as a repetitive behavior devoid of tangible advancement. I mean, it's that feeling of being stuck in a loop, right? An intellectual dead end that feels like you're being responsible, but you're not actually moving forward.
Exactly. And the psychological fallout from that it's significant. We're talking about things like decision fatigue, a constant drain on your attention, and I think most importantly, this slow erosion of trust in yourself.
That part that it's deceptive is so critical. It feels like control. It feels like we're being thorough.
But the real significance, as the text points out, is in the psychological roots. The fear of making a mistake, perfectionism, this insatiable need for certainty that just fuels the whole cycle.
Precisely. And because this behavior is rooted in, both a capable mind and in these deep emotional defenses, it leads to a real disagreement on how to solve it. So the central question we're really getting at here is this. Is the best way to stop overthinking to implement structured external systems and boundaries?
Which is the position you're taking today, that structure is the most reliable path.
It is.
And I'm coming at it from a different angle. While systems are useful, I'm going to argue that true, lasting clarity depends on addressing the underlying psychological drivers first, that need for certainty that's creating all the noise to begin with.
So my core position, and this is supported throughout the source material, is that the most reliable path to getting back control is through applying external structured frameworks. I mean, the text is very clear on this. Overthinking is often just a byproduct of a capable mind operating without boundaries. We have to recognize that the mind is a high-performance engine. It needs restraint. It needs to know when thinking has actually done enough. And this restraint isn't some abstract idea. You make it real through systems that replace mental struggle.
Okay.
I'm talking about concrete things like mental containers for complex problems, where you actually define when, where, and for how long you'll analyze something, and using rigorous decision frameworks that reduce noise. These systems, they give you the structure to stop what the text calls productive inertia, that feeling of moving but going nowhere, and they conserve your finite cognitive bandwidth. We're just managing the output of the engine to get to clear, direct action.
That's an interesting point. And the mechanism there, conserving bandwidth, that's compelling on a cognitive level. I get that. But I would frame the core problem a bit differently. When we focus so much on external frameworks, it feels like we're just building a fancier cage for this symptom. And that cage will always get breached because it doesn't address the pressure from the inside. Cognitive systems just regulate the activity of thought. But for real clarity, you have to address the emotional drivers, specifically the anxiety and the need for certainty that are fueling the compulsion. The source calls overthinking a coping mechanism, a form of emotional avoidance through thinking. We're using analysis to avoid feeling fear or uncertainty or just the discomfort of taking a risk. So until a person learns to sit with discomfort, to tolerate the anxiety of an unresolved issue, they will just keep trying to close all those open loops their brain creates. And the core issue really is the erosion of trust in judgment.
That trust can only be rebuilt through emotional regulation and acceptance, not by the sheer force of an analytical checklist.
But if the overthinker is already convinced their judgment is flawed, which is the whole problem, right? The erosion of self-trust. How do they reliably access that emotional regulation skill you're talking about without some kind of structure to guide them? I mean, they're trapped in the loop. They can't trust their feelings or their thoughts. The systematic approach gives them that immediate objective relief to break the cycle. By externalizing the analysis, they can say, okay, I reviewed the 3 variables I defined, my time box is closed. That external boundary is objective proof that the thinking is done. It's a behavioral fix that comes before the emotional repair.
But you're still not addressing the engine's health. I mean, we're talking about 2 really different things here. Your approach is great for managing complexity, a problem with too many variables. My approach is for the problem of compulsion, the need to review the same 2 variables 100 times. And that compulsion comes from fear. If we don't address that fear, the mind will just redefine the problem and say, well, the system itself is flawed, so now I have to analyze the system.
And that actually brings us to a really crucial point in this discussion, especially when we think about the hardest people to convince, the competent overthinker. This is that high-achieving person whose whole identity is tied to being mentally busy, you know? They think that thinking more means they care more. How do we actually convince that person that their mental energy is being wasted?
That is the key question.
Well, my argument focuses on the practical consequences, what the material calls the counterfeit of competence. We have to persuade them with the concrete advantages of efficiency. The strongest argument is empirical. Overthinking consumes so much mental energy that it directly leads to decision fatigue and it actively slows performance. We show them the data. Structured thinking doesn't suppress their intellect, it channels it. It shows them how to stop wasting their cognitive bandwidth on these repetitive, low-yield loops and apply it to new problems. It's an appeal to their core value of competence. We offer them a tool to become more capable.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that approach for the long term, not for that audience. You risk just reaffirming their underlying story, that their self-worth is only tied to their output. If we just tell them to be more efficient, they might create an even more elaborate system to manage their avoidance. They'll just mistake intricate organization for mental clarity, but they're still avoiding the internal discomfort. The most compelling approach has to expose the long-term human cost. Overthinking creates this profound internal instability where the person feels disconnected from their own intuitive understanding. We convince them by reframing what competence actually means. It's not endless calculation. It's the quiet confidence that comes from stability and adaptability. Showing them that all that mental rehearsal is just emotional protection, a defense mechanism. That's the ethical pivot they need. They need to reclaim their internal peace, not just their productivity.
I understand the desire for that peace, but the costs of overthinking are immediate and they're quantifiable. The capable mind is so susceptible to what the material calls thought inflation. A tiny uncertainty balloons into this huge problem because there are no boundaries. The material shows that thought loses its direction when those boundaries are gone. So setting concrete rules that protect clarity, like a max time for analysis before a decision is forced, that's the firewall you need to stop the repetition. Relying purely on some internal resilience is just too vulnerable to the fear and uncertainty that are constantly warping your perception. You need systems to manage the complexity.
But the complexity is often just a rationalization for the emotional failure. I mean, systems are useful scaffolding, sure, but they completely fail when the thought is driven by an intense emotional trigger, a high-stakes review, a fear of rejection, whatever it is. The core cognitive mistake here is confusing mental activity versus mental clarity. If the mind sees silence as uncomfortable, it will override any system you set up just to generate noise and fill that void. The brain's need for closure just trumps any rational planning tool. So the crucial skill isn't external boundary setting. It's training the pause between thought and reaction. It's an internal skill. It lets a choice emerge in that gap between the emotional signal, the anxiety, and the compulsive thinking. If you don't train that pause, the mental loop starts before the system even has a chance to engage. The system becomes irrelevant.
This isn't an either or. A system can demand a pause. For instance, when a thought loop begins, the system dictates. First, you write the loop down, externalize it. Second, check the clock, the time boundary. Third, move on until the next scheduled analysis block. The structure provides the container for the pause. It makes the skill reliable. Without that structure, the pause relies on willpower, and we know willpower gets drained by decision fatigue.
And that is exactly where we disagree on the hierarchy. That system you just described requires the foundational skill of pausing long enough to even engage it. If the anxiety is high, the compulsion is immediate. The pause just doesn't happen. Emotional regulation is the gatekeeper.
The problem with the systems approach, I think, is that it focuses too heavily on regulation and restraint, which, to a capable mind, can feel like suppression. Well, I see it more as integration. You're right that we have to acknowledge the root fear, but my structure gives you the lever to start practicing the new habit despite the fear. You need a safe space to practice the pause, and the external container provides that.
And that brings us to the ultimate goal here.
Exactly. I agree the practice space is necessary, but the ultimate goal has to be to overcome analysis paralysis and move to action. The systems approach prioritizes trusting action more than thought because, and this is crucial, the text reminds us that clarity is not always a prerequisite for action. The fundamental cost of overthinking is missed opportunity. It's stagnation. Structured thinking makes sure that analysis stays a tool for decision-making, not a replacement for it. We get the car out of the mud, even if the road ahead is still foggy.
That is a compelling argument for moving to action, but I want to go back to what happens after you take the action. The problem isn't just a lack of action, it's the lack of closure even after you've made the commitment. If you force action with a system, but you haven't dealt with the deep-seated fear of error, that perfectionism, the mind just shifts the overthinking from pre-decision analysis to post-decision review. The person keeps burning cognitive bandwidth analyzing the action they just took. The system only provides temporary relief. True, sustainable resolution often comes from acceptance, the willingness to tolerate ambiguity without panic. If we choose presence over prediction, we stop trying to force certainty through analysis. Clarity emerges not when we finished all the analysis, but when we accept that the analysis we did was enough. And that shift is fundamentally emotional, not structural.
I acknowledge that risk of post-action rumination, but the structure can manage that too. If the system includes a mandatory post-mortem review scheduled 1 week later, it eliminates the need for constant monitoring. The mind is assured, I will review this, but not now. The system becomes the guardian of your attention. Without that structure, the post-action loop spirals right back into that internal vulnerability you're talking about.
But the most resilient person, the one with true quiet confidence, is the one who doesn't need the post-mortem review, because they trust the process and they trust their judgment, having made peace with potential imperfection. While systems are a wonderful transitional tool, the final destination has to be reducing the internal need to manage risk through excessive control. And that is an emotional evolution.
Well, this has been a rigorous exchange. It really illuminates the tension between managing a capable mind and addressing the anxieties that drive it. My position remains that while emotional understanding is necessary, structural systems provide the concrete, measurable method you need to restrain and direct the power of the intelligent mind. By creating boundaries and frameworks, we ensure thinking is a reliable tool, preventing the draining costs of mental exhaustion and guaranteeing momentum. We have to regulate the process to regain agency.
And I maintain that cognitive systems can only regulate how we think. They can't regulate why we think. For long-term clarity and for restoring self-trust, the primary focus has to be on cultivating emotional stability and tolerance for uncertainty. That work reduces the mind's foundational need to endlessly analyze and control. If you don't address that core emotional avoidance, the capable mind will always find a way to make noise, and it will just work around any system you put in place.
It seems clear that moving beyond overthinking requires acknowledging both sides of this. The cognitive realities that high intelligence needs disciplined channeling, and the psychological complexities that fear is really the engine of the whole thing.
Indeed. Listeners have to figure out where their primary blockage is. Is it a lack of structure for their powerful thoughts? Or is it an inability to tolerate the essential ambiguity of life? Finding that balance between external structure and emotional grounding, that's the key to achieving that quiet confidence.
Thank you for joining us for The Debate.
That wraps up today's journey. Thanks to my friends for sharing their thoughts, and to you for being part of this circle. Remember, inspiration isn't found once, it's built every day in small choices. If this talk spoke to you, share it, follow along, and let's keep the conversation alive. Until next time, stay curious and stay inspired.